You're gonna have to bear with me because I am not feeling 100% today, but today I went to a lecture on human embryology and I had such an interesting conversation and heard interesting things in this lecture that I want to share with you because I think it's so important for us to think deeply about small human beings. A couple brief things to keep in mind: there are 3,000 abortions every single day in America. Another interesting statistic is that there are over 1 million embryos in biofreezers across the nation. They ended up in those biofreezers after the IVF process. So today in this lecture on human embryology, this professor explained how when embryos are developing, it is possible to use them for scientific experimentation. It is easiest for people who do these kinds of experiments to experiment on an embryo who has come to be as a result of IVF because they're already in a petri dish or in that kind of situation. So it's easier to give them to a scientist and to have experiments done on them. Mind you, leading up to this explanation of, hey, you could someday, if you did IVF, you could donate your embryo to science and they could experiment on them. Leading up to that, we were doing a full lecture on the development of the preborn human. And so, very interestingly, this professor made a statement I think is so fascinating. He says, your first name was zygote. It's the first thing you were ever called. So true. So at the moment of sperm and egg fusion, there's a brand new separate human being. Fertilization has occurred. There is a zygote now. So very early form embryo. And all of us began as that very tiny zygote. So we're having this very thorough lecture on the development of this human being. It starts with a zygote, who is going to go through different stages of human life as an embryo and eventually implant into the mother's womb and grow through all these stages. So we're looking at all these images of teeny single-celled zygotes, and then we're looking at the embryo in various stages, and then we're looking at the fetus and what they develop to be and to look like, and then we look at the neonate and who they are. So if fertilization is actually taking place outside the womb through IVF, then there are other ethical complexities. So typically, when a baby is created through in vitro fertilization, there are 3 potential outcomes of that child. One is that they could be transferred for pregnancy, meaning that doctor or embryologist or whatever gives an opportunity to that baby to implant into either their mother's womb or a womb, and then that child can have an opportunity at pregnancy and birth and survival outside of the petri dish, basically. Another potential outcome, some of these babies get donated to science, where they will not survive the experimentation. Just for the sake of clarity, the embryo, my understanding is, goes in alive to the scientific experimentation and will be not living at the end of the experimentation. And then the third option of modern embryos is that they could be just thrown straight in the garbage. And a lot of times embryologists recommend that embryos be disposed of when they are ill. So if they do a test on embryos and they find that they seem to have a genetic disorder, the embryologist will usually encourage parents to discard those embryos. I believe this entire process is very ethically complex. There have been so many valuable, precious people that have come to be as a result of IVF, and I think it's important to acknowledge that our species membership as humans, it starts at the beginning of human life. So because we have 2 human parents, we are all also human beings from the moment of fertilization. It's the same with other species. We put 2 dogs together, they're going to reproduce another dog. 2 cats are going to reproduce another cat. So species membership starts at the very beginning. Human beings also deserve to have human rights and protection from harm. So that means not intentionally killing them, just like we also believe it's wrong to intentionally kill those who are born. Children are dependent not merely when they're in the womb, but also after birth. Newborn infants are not magically independent. They're not. They're very, very dependent, and yet we have laws to protect them from killing. So a lot of the reasons why we justify destroying or killing unborn embryos or fetuses, we would not use with a neonate, which I think shows us that there's something wrong with our ethics and how we treat the smallest humans in our world today. So I totally didn't want to be unkind or inflammatory in any way, but I did want to offer this professor a different perspective. And so I did wait till the lecture was over because it seemed more appropriate to share it then. And I went up to the professor and I just said, hey, would you be comfortable with me sharing a different perspective on scientific experimentation on embryos? And he said yes. I shared the story of some people I know. So I know of a family that had multiples through IVF, and that after the IVF cycle, there were remaining embryos left over. I think it was very tormenting for those siblings to know that there was an embryo that remained in the biofreezer and that they had already been born. There are stories, if you look them up online, of people who are siblings of an embryo who's still in the biofreezer, and you can literally hear adults who have a sibling still in the biofreezer because of IVF. And they'll talk about, maybe someday when I'm 30 or whatever, when I'm married, I'm gonna just transfer that embryo into my own womb and like gestate their own sibling. This is the kind of torment it can cause people to know that their sibling is suspended, frozen, in the state of the freezer as an embryo. That's a member of their family, and they know this is a sibling, someone who deserves love and care and help, at least an opportunity at pregnancy. And I was just sharing that family story with this professor, and I showed him a picture actually of the multiple birth from the IVF cycle, and I just said, hey, like, just like the multiples who were born deserved an opportunity to be born and to live and a chance to thrive, so did the remaining embryos who were left in the biofreezer. And we talked about how we really want to do all these scientific experimentations on these embryos, but they are human lives. The professor originally made a statement in his lecture saying that at one point some kind of group had made billboards saying, don't do scientific experimentation on embryos, it's killing the babies. And he said, no, that's not real. And that was one of those moments I was like, I would like to have a conversation with you about that. We don't always recognize embryos as babies because they look smaller in their human development, and they may not have developed the same types of like physical traits we have because they're so tiny. But all the embryo actually needs is proper nutrition and care and time and pregnancy, and they will develop the traits that we have that make us appear more familiar. So even if the embryo is very small, they are still equally worthy of human rights. And I was able to share that story of the family I know, that an embryo who is in a biofreezer for these reasons, because they're a human being, because they too are a member of the human family, they're worthy of protection from harm. They should also be protected from scientific experiments that they did not consent to. Just like as adults, we can consent to people doing scientific experiments upon us, and even after our own deaths, we can say, hey, sure, take my body and use it maybe in a school or something and teach people about the human body. That's something we consent to as adults. The embryo does not have the capacity to consent to be experimented upon, and certainly not to be killed, and it's wrong to destroy them. So a couple takeaways from this conversation. Sometimes we believe if we go and we hear secular lectures on embryology and human development and reproduction, sometimes we believe that it's almost like we make ourselves pariahs if we're against the intentional killing of embryos and fetuses. We go, oh, well, people aren't going to understand. They might be open to hearing what you have to say. Talking about the nature of the embryo, that they have two human parents, they are also a human being. That could potentially change that person's mind. So don't treat yourself like a pariah. If you believe in human rights for all humans, including those in the womb, remember your perspective is important and it matters. And if you share it, it could really impact someone, maybe change their mind. Also, IVF is so incredibly ethically complex. It leads to the harming of a lot of embryos. If you are here as a result of IVF, I want you to know I love you so deeply. I'm so glad you're here. Your life is an immense gift. Would never undo that, for sure. But also, I want us to remember the 1 million embryos in biofreezers that are left in a state of just being frozen, and many of whom will end up being thrown in the garbage or will maybe be given for these scientific experimentations. And that is not ethical. Those embryos deserve better treatment. The IVF industry has done a lot of very unethical things. And then a last thought here, I am not against scientific innovation and medical innovation. I actually think both are so cool. I think there are a lot of really amazing ways for us to do scientific innovation, and there are types of stem cell research I support, like adult stem cell research, where the adult has consented to giving their stem cells. There's a way to collect the placenta and umbilical cord after birth, and to use those for scientific innovation. I think that's a great use of tissues that are no longer needed after delivery, and I think that's helped a lot of people. What I'm specifically against is this separate whole living human, the embryo, being intentionally killed for the sake of their cells and to try to develop organs from someone who's meant to be a full human. A really basic way to talk about issues pertaining to embryos and ethics is a very simple syllogism. It says, it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Or in this case, I'm going to add another caveat to this. Scientific research on an embryo that will lead to their death, that's intentional killing. Since it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, and that is what abortion and these scientific experimentations upon embryos do, then we know it's actually a human rights violation.